Okay. So
Okay.
then, Joydeep, will you take
Yes.
it away?
Yeah. Yeah. So shall I start?
Yes, please.
Yes. Yes. So first, I put the switch of my camera because of some internet issues. So is it okay for everyone? Put my camera off. Hello.
That's okay.
Okay. So the title of my paper is "The Refugee Camp Projected as Other: An Interpretation of the Strange Character of Life." So I already sent it. So in this presentation, I just summarize this on my paper. Actually, the aim to understand aim of this paper to understand the caste question in the light of the spatial arrangement of the refugee refugee settlement in West Bengal. Most refugee camps are constructed in time, in hyphen time, of the exigency of the influx of refugee, that is, in the hurried condition of providing temporary shelter and necessities such as food, water, and medicine in order to ensure the refugee's survival. In this sense, the physical construction of the refugee camp has portrayed as different or other from the settlement of host society or any other refugee settlement. Scholarly engagement in the refugee studies has mostly interpreted the refugee camp either as the content of the displaced people or as a space of exception that produce new kind of hospitality, agency, and identity. However, such kind of interpretation of the refugee camp functioned or physically as a kind of space of other. In the subcontinent, more specifically in West Bengal, the refugee question is deeply connected to the question of caste, while the refugee camp largely represented as temporary shelter of the lower caste refugees. Mainly, Profulla Chakraborty's seminal book is Marginal Man, where he pointed out the particular category of people who took shelter at the refugee camp. Thus, in the subcontinent, the refugee camp does not just refer as other by the physical construction, but rather concern the question of caste as well. In this paper, first I try to explicate how the refugee camp has been projected as other, that is, understand the strange character of the life in the camp. And next, my paper uh, explained how, as other, the refugee camp exists with the other, such as non-camp settlement and colony refugee settlement. And lastly, it will explain how refugee is represented as other in terms of caste. The concept of other here uh, is substantially inspired by the work of Martin Heidegger, who offered the most meticulous interpretation of design with other and everyday being with in this being and time. And his conceptualization of other is not the opposite of I, rather, it substantially unfolds the care of I and the way of becoming free from it. In this sense, the other is a circumstance to encounter the common concern of the being and bring back to the being to understand itself. It is a kind of knowing oneself not as object of concern, but rather of solicitude. Here, the method of interpretation is to understand the refugee camp afresh and explore the core of the understanding of refugee question in terms of other. However, the basic premises of such interpretation is addressing the strangeness of the camp, that is, of an unknown character. So the my first portion of this paper, which I sent, that is rehabilitation policy, divided the refugee as other. Actually, in this portion, I am trying to answering the most three eminent refugee studies scholar, which is Paul Gilroy, his book Between the Refugee Camp, and Ravel Needs, Barged Ware, and Claudio Minca, Geography of the Refugee Camp. Most these three fellows meticulously try to interpret camp as a space of open and as a whole. But when we understand the strangeness and the question of other, sometimes refugee policy made the other within the camp refugees. And the paper is focusing on the those who are early refugees, those who are migrated after partition, immediate after partition, or 50s, they treated as the old refugees, and those who came into the camp after 1971. These were treated as new refugees. So there have a distinction between old refugee and new refugee within the camp space. But it does not mean these old refugee and new refugees are opponent, right? So sometimes old refugees takes initiative to take care of the new refugees, and I explained this one reference, that is Dasharat Biswas, who belonged to the old refugee families, but he take care when the government 1960s, 59 and 60s stopped the rehabilitation as assistants during the Dandakarana project. He initiated the movement and went to the Delhi, and again the all kind of assistance started. So in this first section, I just pointed out this adherence is a kind of rehabilitation policy where refugees making the two different bodies, but they have a kind of care and concern of the new refugees by the old, and they make the space as a body. So the next section, I explain how camp exists with other. Other here, other is the colony settlement mainly. It is not that colony settlements totally opposite of the camp. I here I refer the two colony settlement, that is Korunamui and the Nasra colony, where Korunamui earlier Corona colony mainly initiated by the Cooper's camp refugees, and they occupied the land and established the colony. But later on, the Korunamui became the part of the refugee camp. It is now in the ward number 10, and the paper explained how it became a part of the camp, and I explained that there have a kind of common language between the Kouramui and the Hoopers, and through that language the unity has come. And also the Nasra colony, which is quite far from the Hoopers mainly, but I see that initial protest or resistance, the refugee were gathering or taking initiative the resistance, like earlier camp refugee leaders like Jotin Shah, Ratish Mullik, Panchanan Bishas. They went to this Nasra colony, and Nasra colonies uh, uh, have not such kind of surveillance, so they can gather and they exchange their ideas, and how to unify against the administration of the camp, and make their demand to the proper dole, which is a rehabilitation assistant, proper lice, wheat, etc. So, in that sense, the colony sometimes close to the camp, but if we see the resistance of the camp refugee movement actually in West Bengal, where colony refugees is quite far from the camp refugee movement, which I am not discuss here. And the last section of my paper, where I explained the camp as other in terms of caste. Actually, the refugee project themselves as other in terms of loss of their fixed location or cultural tradition. Therefore, refugee as other in human geography or anthropological interpretation largely follow more historical path where they have no pass through a stage of separation from the new land. The concept of other primarily lies in the sudden appearance of camp because, along with its functional and structural concept, which marks its strange character, there is a similarity of practice and customs. It refers a particular character of sign that is specifically special and refer to a circumstances by which we can trace the way it arises. In other words, the separate status correlate to the body of the refugee, or we can explicate that the camp refugee were easily identified by their dress and poor health condition. And in this paper, I explained that how the outside the camp peoples were interpreted, particularly reference of the Sudhir Shah, how he explained this when the camp refugees were coming out from their from the camp areas, and they can easily identify. And however, these become uh, identical in the gaze of other when they cross the boundary of the camp and refer to their belonging to a particular spatial condition. In this sense, the refugees in the camp carried out the sign of otherness and signified not only the physical structure of the space, but the relation of the refugees was assigned to the environment. So, the sign can address the question of other and it manifested in the narrative of the people outside the space. The narrative of the outside boundary of the camp may unfold the sign and features in the consideration of the otherness. The interpretation of other is not directly involved in the question of caste. Rather, kind represent a kind of distancing between the refugee and the local. This direct attention towards a particular environment, habit, and social relation that effectuated its appearance outside the boundary of the camp. On the other hand, the refugees in the camp refugees were also concerned how they were interpreted outside. Particularly, I refer this one experience that Sudhir Shah, he comments on the inmate of the camp that once people in Ranaghat were scared of the name of the coopers because the place was dangerous of them in terms of activity of the refugees. However, sign refers the life in the camp that correspond an impure status. The existence of the camp is not clinically referred as impure, rather, sign corresponds the similar kind of practice, form of life, language, and separation. We can argue that this separation make the camp an identical character in terms of status of pure and impure. The status of impurity directly involved the existence of camp that form a separation and simultaneously it entanglement spatio-temporal situation. Therefore, separation or other of the camp is a conceptual intervention beyond the historical manifestation. If we focus on its appearance or how it occurred, the phenomena show how the camp is constructed in a hurried situation with respect to the influx of the refugee and the life continuously facing uncertainty in the future. So impurity address specific circumstances where the lower caste refugees were largely taking temporary shelter and finding a home in the new environment. Mainly, upper caste has a clear vision. Those who are take temporary shelter it has a clear vision towards selecting the camp as a temporary shelter and perception of how long they would continue to be present in the space. Particularly, I am referring here the one text by Dulalendra Bandyopadhyay, Ora Ajo Bastu, which is mainly his experience on the Dhulia camp. And occupational, the non-agricultural refugees of the camp was not merely depend upon the government rehabilitation assistance. Rather, their intention was to manage permanent rehabilitation and leave the space. The agricultural refugee family were temporarily without any fixed duration or without a perception of how long they would be present in the camp. In this sense, signs largely indicate the refugee families whose way of life found more possibility in the spatio-temporal condition. Everyday life in the camp had a similar form of practice, but strange reality addressed these refugees, those who lived without any clear vision or perception about their future rehabilitation. In this sense, question of caste in camp manifested in the form of life that suffer in that condition in an indefinite manner. I stop it here, and later I will explain in the question session. Thank you.
Anirban, go ahead.
Thank you, Joydipda. And you have referred to Nashra camp, which is just one step away from my place that I am now. And I was thinking that at the post-partition moment, when we were talking about this refugee and rehabilitation camp, these camps are the most absolute biopolitical space where in which power confronts nothing but pure life, and so life simultaneously bound and abandoned at the same time. And it's the bare existence where everything is possible. But I was wondering, or I was thinking, what would be your take, or what would be your opinion about when, at this moment, when this first partition moment, from the moment of abandonment or boundedness, what are the conditions, what are the status of these people at this political moment of this refugee settlement?
I understand it. Yes, Rokti, Anirban, sorry. There is a one argument that most of the scholars, the historians are quite criticize the bare life from. I am not that is the bare life from the very Agamben's proposition is very Eurocentric approach. But I don't think so in that way, because they have a substantial work on bare life and colonialism. There is a text also, Agamben and Colonialism by Marcelo Savasky and Samuel Bignall. Absolutely bare life condition. My proposition was how they speak in kind of abandonment or in kind of fear, anxiety, nullity. So in my thesis, where I argued that initially camps face quite keeping silence because of such kind of space where rules, norms, death is very prominent in everyday life, and also the kind of nullity. This no one knows what kind of space it is actually. So the silence is not that is the outside of the discourse actually, but silence is formation of the discourse. What I argue. So initially, the condition was kind of silence, but this kind of silence, they understand the space very authentically. So when we see the camp refugee movement in the later phase, that is I am not talking about is hyper political, but Paul Gilroy is talking about this camp movement is hyper political, but it's a kind of discourse which comes from the silence, right?
Well, what is your take on about the transition at the moment? Because they are most of them are appropriated into the majoritarian political discourse and all these things. But some people who are outside, there is an experiential disjuncture between them, because they are outside. There, you are talking about Manoranjan Bapari, and when you are talking about that when he is invited to go to the refugee camp and give a talk to them as some kind of before the election kind of thing. So he got frightened, afraid of going into the thing. So, but the transition that happened after 50 or 60 years in the 90s or in the first half of the
they are very static. Actually, I am not making any comments which is very kind of right or wrong, but I can say this camp refugee discourse mainly going through that spatio-temporal condition at present also. Sometimes they are supporting different kind of political organization, but this is a kind of strategy actually. That's I can say. And get particularly involved in that spatial aspect, and also that Cooper's Camp notified movement, where they this is 10 years movement, which is particularly that special condition, and when they boycott the election and then other kind of government assistance, that is their strategies. So every camp has its own kind of condition, which is I cannot say that every camp has a similar way, because there have a type of camps. Coopers is a permanent transit camp, and also my PhD work is the Dhubulia camp, which is permanent liability camp. But they have a different kind of crisis, but there have a common traits between the all camp. That is the temporality. They are now. Yes.
Joydeep, sorry, Shamrat has another question, and then we should, if Shamrat, if you can be precise and concise, and Joydeep, if you can be concise in your response, that would be good.
Yeah.
It's a very quick, very quick comment, just to corroborate your argument, because I also worked on the discourse of refugee camp towards the end of my paper. I think, and I defined the Dalit identity in terms of death, disease, ailing body, and tattered clothes, and those things also come in your presentation. And I just wanted to say that it is a kind of, and you did not, what is interesting in your work is you always don't present caste directly in your discussion. But caste, it becomes a signifier of caste. You have used the word sign, which is very interesting to me. That sign which actually signifies caste, the signs, like the tattered clothes. And those create a kind of value, a system of value. I'm using the word value in the way Spivak has used, extracting it from the economic context into the cultural context. Any form of value production also at the same time creates a kind of alienation. So almost like the Dalit subjects, the lower caste subjects are alienated from the mainstream by these signs, the signs of used tattered clothes, poor quality of food, which comes very prominently in your discussion. And I just wanted to make this comment. Thank you.
Yes. Absolutely, Samrat, you are right, because sign absolutely indicate this, the question of Dalit or caste issue. And if the resistance in the camp, that is also I can understand through that kind of sign character they are having, because it is not too much time, but I just roughly say this camp refugee movement initiated by the upper caste, actually, what I find. But lower caste people or the mainly agricultural refugees, the nomos, they joined when this question comes the necessity of their existence in the space, or essence of their existence in the space, which is close to the question of home and homelessness. The question of home in the question of Dandakaran project, that's the comes to the lower caste refugee resistance. So this is the shiny character actually when we are talking about the caste or Dalit questions in consideration of camp. Thank you.
Thank you, Joydeep. Let us take a break for 5 minutes. It's 10:01 where I am. It should be, what is it, 7:30 in Kolkata?
Yeah, 7:31.
7:31. Let's reconvene at 7:36. Hello, Anirban, do you want to start us out?
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Deepanda, and thank you, Kullan, and thank you all the participants here. In my paper, I have basically attempted to understand and delve into the very nook and interiority of Dalit self-writing and the question of untranslatability of the particular experiential space. The idea of untranslatable as not something that one cannot translate, but that's something one never stops translating or not translating. A persistent epistemological preparation and falling into the gap or trap of the double bind between an inevitable semiotic failure and an uncompromising and unyielding endeavor or constant self-revising moves toward an ethical semiosis. And when it concerns the question of the untranslatable, or the question of semiotic failure as it dredges into the certain kind of, or I can say, certain idea of the interiority of perception in relation to Dalit selfhood, it must have to tackle with the constitutive thinking on the production of the subject. And subject being a too strong word, to put it here at the outset, I have tentatively and carefully begun with invoking in this paper the Hegelian notion of recognition, and in correspondence, the picture of the epistemograph, Hegelian epistemograph. And in that structural picture, the subject yet to be is assigned to a place. This is a very important word as far as the Hegelian logic of science is concerned. Thus, verhaltnis, which one actually appropriates, accepts, appropriates, and makes one's own. And this word has been very much used by Kant, Hegel, Marx, and every time they use the word, they mean it assigning a kind of appropriate place, an assigned place in the epistemograph. So when they are using the word thus verhaltnis, then they are implying that you are already into that assigning system, that system of signification. And signification just not means meaning, rather making into a sign or assigning. And here I again keep myself willfully remained into the double bind of and that Marx and Hegel actually conflicting with each other, the question of life and consciousness. Leben and Bewusstsein, which determines what? That dichotomy. And when I attempt to read Franz Fanon's Black Skin and White Mask, particularly the chapter titled The Black Man and Hegel, actually which is titled The Negro and Recognition, chapter 7, the final chapter, I actually discover and underline that the black man that was actually termed the nigger, low experience vécu de noir, is constantly preoccupied with self-evaluation and the ego ideal, and discovered that Fanon, going back to the question of recognition and diagnoses this system of assignment as the governing fiction. He used a very strong word, the most stupendous frauds of our time, in which one is narcissistically stuck so long as he never knows himself. And Fanon attempts to undo this sign system, that assigning system, reading and using carefully Hegel against Hegel. And this paper, in the first part of the discussion, attempts to drive deep into this bare open. Before you are with your verhaltnis, before you are being linguistified and assigned, this fixed, closed, restricted mediatedness. And consciousness in Hegel is simply being for itself, and it has already undergone a transformation from a kind of subjective certainty to objective truth. That is constantly happening in Hegel, from one certainty to another kind of certainty, from one height to another height, from Gewissheit that is the subjective certainty to the objective truth or height. So epistemograph actually moves from one kind of certainty to another kind of certainty. And to break and unsettle this kind of notion of certainty, Fanon actually attempted to put a chapter on death drive of the black man, death wish of the black man, of the Negroes. And here at this point, I ask that does the politics of undoing, that unsettlement, necessitate the search for an understanding of the sentient soul itself, naturally unmediated, that is thus natürlich unmittelbar, that bareness of the soul before being linguistified, and language is conceived as already aufgehoben, already affid. So I am in this paper, that paper I have actually circulated here, that trying to understand that sense of in itselfness, the politics or epistemological moment of in itselfness, that bare existence, bareness of life, before being it is linguistified, aufgehoben. And I would also like to examine if Dalit autobiographies can anyway open up this specific fold of interiority that ungrounds this commanding human pathology and initiates the will to social justice. And in this paper, I actually begin with a moment, not a purely textual moment, if not historical, that is from Homer's Odyssey, book 18. And here we find that Odysseus making an entry into the court of Penelope, disguised as a beggar. And the rich nobleman who first saw the muscular man with perfectly crafted abs in tattered, ragged clothes, I remember Shamradda's paper, Tatteredness, asked the question, stranger, will you become my thing, my servant? The first question, stranger, will you become my thing, my servant? And that question actually assumed a significant shape and became the question in Karl Marx's On the Jewish Question, and in which he basically deals with the question of human alienation. And Marx delves into the functioning of the invisible but perceptible contract which guarantees the right of the new master to manipulate the elusively free human beings as things, as objects without will. And here I ask, the moot question that arises here is that, what are the ontological determinants of the freely chosen acceptance of servitude as an a priori necessity? If we go back to Aristotle, Politics, Book 1, Aristotle is talking about two types of servitude, the natural slavery and legal slavery. And Aristotle defines natural slave as anyone who, while being human, is by nature not his own, but of someone else. And he has defended his theory by arguing that natural slaves are born as slaves, and it is their fate to be ruled by someone who is able to think rationally. That is very important. And what is most daring and disturbing in the Aristotelian structure of reason is that a particular historical insight, an isolated insight, gains density and gets embedded in a thoroughly ahistorical general conception. That is very important. And this is, again, what Fanon actually diagnosed with Hegel, with Adler, and this is theoretical position with the Antillean society. The ideological need designs servitude as a structural principle in complete conformity with nature itself. And as we move into the Indic space and attempt to offer a symptomatic reading of the textual discourse, of course, keeping in mind very much that the very particularity of the differential scale, we see that Manu Samhita, Manusmriti, Manava Dharma Shastra, the defining document of Brahminical Hinduism, repeatedly says, Dasam Sudram Dijanmanam, 8403. And it is to be noted that in the Indic space, the Varna Dharma scheme maneuvers the social historical totality. And the inauthentic rely on the magic device of nature that Ishita actually talked about. And I'm interconversing in this paper that becomes a necessity for the philosopher's explanation of historically established inequalities. And between the production of the concept and the obvious forgetting of the process of production, I would argue, lies that bare existence. And my first question is, that I have pitched in this paper. What is this mode of bare living? That Dalitness itself in its natural immediacy, the phenomenological consciousness before being inscribed a fixed assigned identity. And aligned with it, a series of questions. Is there any experiential disjunction between the Dalits' lived experience as given and self-evident and the outsider's perception regarding it? Jaydeep was talking about refugee settlement and the people outside the refugee camps. And what is this interior perception, which is essentially undisclosable? What is this being in the world, which is both present but perfectly accessible and perfectly inaccessible at the same time? And here at this point, I have tried to make a close and careful reading of a couple of Bangla Dalit autobiographies. Manohar Mouli Biswas's autobiography, Surviving in My World, Amar Bhubone Ami Beche Thaki, and Manoranjan Bapari's autobiography, Interrogating My Chandal Life, Itibitte Chandal Jivon. But I am not going into the detailing of this thing. I'm just talking about the basic conceptual kind of thing, which actually opens up a curious topo in which the peculiar sense of alienation and self-encirclement is textually perceived. I am just giving one instance. In Biswas's small book of poems titled Bibikto Uthone Ghar, a hut in a segregated compound, centers around and the trades of an ethical encounter with the other. And in one of the poems in the collection titled Alienation, it opens up with a scene of hospitality, and Pasna invokes the figure of Vivekananda, who had identified himself with the Shudras. And the poem goes like that: "Oh Vivekananda, I am at your door. I'm knocking again. I am a Sudra, but I am different from the Sudra you felt pain for. In my house is cooked low-grade grain. I eat in the slums of the city, of factories, Kolkata. The half-cooked meat of pig, snake, rat, snail, etc. Did you ever stay the night in such a place? I am very eager to know." There are thousands of references and instances there throughout the book. And as we read the text, we see that the self of the Dalit, as itself an immediate, is constitutive of the animal other. It betrays a phenomenology of perception, which is the singular property of the Dalit/animal. The cogito, we find that is constantly negotiating with its animality. And it is a mode of being in the world that stays outside the torus of human reason. And translation of this being in remains a risky task. And while I was going through the translations by Jaydeep Sarangi and Shipra Mukherjee, a tremendous kind of failure. We can talk about this in any time. As I have attempted to read and argue that Dalit autobiographies are scripting of this built-in radicalism and fundamentally a failure of assigning and transaction. And in the paper, then we come back to the question of that and politics aligned with it, politics of the tactile, with a close listening of the specific text, as I tried to understand that the calculus of hatred is compatible with the individual's grade in the ladder of Varnasrama. And central idea there is that of contamination. The disgusted person feels defiled by the object, thinking that it has somehow entered the self. And this phenomenology of Dart has its biopolitical implications. It has the potential to rupture the hierarchical reality, because Dart is a kind of conglomerative compendium which includes all the rejected elements of the ordered systems. It enters the body, invaginates. The structure spreads out and engulfs the whole, the sacred body. But here I ask, is not impurity our ontological condition? I am impure, therefore I exist. The Buddha, meditating on the loathsomeness of the human body, used the term kaya sadgati to indicate that all 32 parts of the human body are impure. In the Mahavagga of the Vinaya Pitaka, the Blessed One, Tathagata Buddha, makes a radical enunciation. I quote, "I found there no more delight either in visible things or sounds or tastes because I understood that whatever belongs to existence is filth. So either invisible things. With this, I come back to the question of visibility and invisibility. In Indian philosophical tradition, we can notice a slight semantic difference between the two words, touch, sparsha, and contact, sangjaga, especially in the Nyaya Vaisheshika tradition. Aristotle foresaw manifold aporias in the experience of the touch. To touch is to move toward an object, to bring surfaces into contact. Therefore, to touch is to approach, to be approached. But the most problematic axiom is sight is touching. If we go back to Merleau-Ponty's book, The Visible and the Invisible, or the Phenomenology of Perception, there is a tremendous kind of analysis of this idea of sight, and sight is touching. The visible, the touchable, and the invisible, untouchable, are in a reversible relation. And in a fundamental sense, it is the invisible, untouchable that grounds the visibility, touchability of the world. The being of the Dalit is grafted within this ever-existent auto-reflective relation. And very quickly, my final proposition, therefore, stands in a world of entangled relationality and intersubjective communicability with otherness, difference, untouchability is an impossible concept. I have elaborated this idea in the final part of the paper. And with this theoretical premise or promise, I would now go back to the politics of assigned system and offer an alternative reading of Manusmriti 9.335. Manusmriti, there is a sloka that goes like Suchi utprishta sustrasa midavaka nirahankara brahmanadasra nityam utprishtam jatam asmrite. It goes like that from Medatithi, the first commentator, 820 to 1050 CE, one of the oldest and most famous commentators on the text, to Panchanan Tarkaratna, 1866-1940, the commentaries and explanatory notes are roughly like this. A Sudra who is pure, the servant of his betters, gentle in his speech and free from pride, and always seeks a refuge with the Brahmanas, attains a higher caste in his next life.
Anirban, I'm sorry, you're running out of time.
I'm just coming to the conclusive portion of my paper.
Okay,
just
thank you.
The conclusion. So this sloka goes like that: a Sudra who is pure, the servant of his betters, gentle in his speech and free from pride, and always seeks a refuge with Brahmanas, attains a higher caste in his next life. But in the most recent exegesis by Manavendu Bandyopadhyay, 2009, there I discovered and located a slight but very significant adjectival shift. Bandyopadhyay, in his 120-page long introduction to the text, interprets the sloka this way. See the transformation. The Sudra, by serving that Dija, who is pure, learned in the Vedas, gentle in his speech, and free from pride, attains the higher caste. This hermeneutic shift is of paramount importance. It has opened up, I submit, a counter discourse that would unsettle the entire epistemic paradigm. The Brahmana, in the hermeneutic redesign, has been affirmed as the abstract pure, the sign representing a totally different content. Einen ganz anderen Inhalt, Derrida reading Hegel. From what it has in itself, the body of the signifier is not only its own body, corpse proper, but its own tomb. The absolute alterity between the signifying body given to intuition, unshown, and the ideal representation signified by the body. The politics of self-worlding for the culturally under-resourced here gets attuned and adjusted with the modes of dressmaking rather than sign-making as resistance in the new conditions of globalizability. It issues up the unnerving moment of the semiotic, the question of the untranslatable, and the radical unconcealment, unverworrenheit of existence as fatal autoimmunity and conditional democracy cancel each other out. The hardest lesson, however, is the impossible intimacy of the ethical. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anirban. Yeah, the floor is open for questions. We have about, unfortunately, not too long, 5 to 10 minutes. So please raise your hands or just jump in.
Yes,
Shamrat has
Shamrat.
a question. Yeah.
Shamrat, go ahead.
Yeah, like I'm asking too many questions, but then if other people doesn't have just
No. That's why we have organized this workshop.
yeah,
Yeah.
maybe I can have some like corroborations with what you are saying. One important work I referred, since you have also referred to the black politics and the dead drive of the black man.
Yes.
One text by Abdul Jan Muhammad called
Yeah.
Death-Bound Subject.
Yes.
He's talking about the African slave, the experience of death in case of the African slave actually nullifies the possibility of death as an immanent existence, which threatens the body and self. So it's a kind of inversion of the epistemology of
Yes.
trying to stay alive. And another interesting thing in your presentation is like I was just thinking through that the way you talked about the margins, the Dalit people actually like questioning their forms of natural life, like through their positioning of their life before being inscribed linguistically, before being inscribed. That idea of bare life, not only bared by the state, by the power, but the bare life which exists before being linguistically appropriated into the system of power. And it immediately reminds of Derrida's appropriation of Plato's term khora, where the uninscribed body, the uninscribed maternal body, almost which is pregnant with new possibilities. And the kind of, because you have mentioned Manohar Mouli Vishwas, which is also a text I worked on. And Manohar Mouli Vishwas's work clearly shows that how Dalit life is naturalized. He uses the metaphor of Pishnika, that is water hyacinth. The Dalit life is like water hyacinth which flows across the river. So this form of naturalization can be denaturalized by positing the originary moment when such inscriptions have not happened. So it's a kind of epistemological possibility of inverting through the system of through the alienating system of the Brahminism, which transforms them into natural life and then alienates.
Exactly. Yes. That Brahmin considered as the sign that can be undercut, unsettled. And I was thinking about Jan Muhammad. I read your paper that you referred to him, and I was thinking that Fano was actually talking about this. And if it can be a thesis can be done on the Dalit life world and the act of suicide, how they commit suicide. They don't. Fano saw that people don't think that black men could commit suicide. That, and he actually collected the data, and he found out that 318 black women committed suicide in a year, and 76 men committed suicide in the same year. And that is very interesting. And he actually wanted to write a paper and write a chapter, in fact, in his book on Black Skin White Mask, on Negro life and suicide. So we can think in correspondence with that how we can think about the act of suicide, act of committing suicide, and the Dalit life world, how it can create the politics of unsettlement, and it can be associated with the system of assigning kind of thing, that assigning, because the metaphor of the tomb is very important. And you have actually brought into discussion the idea of khora. And Derrida was actually reading Hegel, and he was using the term Vorstellung, that some internal chit-chats are happening within the space of the body. And when this some of them slips out, and gets determined, then it's become the act of signification, meaning making system, it into the meaning making system. I was thinking of that moment before being linguistified, because language is already affixed, already aufhebend. That is happening there. And this term is Rede. In German, it's called Rede. I was thinking about this Rede, and in that case, translation becomes an act of impossible necessity. And that's what was I was actually bringing in my paper here. So thank you for your comment.
Yeah, very, very interesting comment. Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you so much,
Many things
Anirban.
to say, but no time.
Yes, yes.
I'm so sorry, but we have to keep, moving on. There's so much I'd have liked to ask.
Yes. Thank you.
Let's take a break. Let's take a 5-minute rest, and then Kollan will present next. Kullan?
Yes. Shall I start?
Yeah, do you want to start? Start.
Yeah, I can start.
তোমার ভিডিওটা চালিয়ে দাও।
আচ্ছা আচ্ছা আসলে আমার চার্জ বোধহয় কম আছে, so but I will switch it on and then might have to just switch it off again in the middle.
হ্যাঁ।
Right. Okay, so how much time do I have? Yes.
30 minutes. So, speak for as long as you wish. And
No, I don't want to speak for a long period of time. I'll just speak for 10 to 15 minutes. I'll try to be as short as possible, and then I'll open the floor for discussions. My paper is basically a section from my doctoral dissertation, and I thought it would be a good idea to share some of these thoughts with this kind of an audience, an informed audience, to get some feedback for the monograph that I'm trying to write in the days to come. It's the third chapter from my dissertation that focuses on the different Dalit constituencies and their cultural utterances, literary articulations from the area known as jungle mahals. So it's basically the literary and cultural productions of the Dalits in contemporary West Bengal, in that part of contemporary West Bengal that is known as jungle mahals. And in the chapter, I have explored other things, but I'll just focus quickly on two significant registers of the kind of cultural articulations we witness in this part of West Bengal. One is, the first one is what we call the Mullibashi politics. This is a politics of autochthony that I want to briefly talk about. And the second register through which we can talk about the Dalit cultural articulations in this part of Bengal is to look at the writings of some of the Dome writers, Dome poets, writers belonging to the Dome community, which is a significant community in this part of Bengal, alongside Bauris and Bagdis and other Dalit constituencies. But before that, just a couple of lines on the general argumentative arc in my doctoral dissertation. My doctoral dissertation is trying to look at how Dalits conceptualize their communitarian pasts. So it's a work in the domain of historiography. It tries to speak to some of the philosophical, ideological concerns, anxieties, and underpinnings of the subaltern studies historiography. It does not dismiss the fundamental philosophical arguments in terms of the larger critique of Enlightenment modernity that subaltern studies attempts to. It does not become polemically dismissive about the hobnobbing of subaltern studies with the somewhat nebulous contours of post-colonial studies. And at the same time, it does not entirely accept the framework, the lens of the subaltern studies historiography to look at the ways through which Dalits in contemporary West Bengal conceptualize and reconceptualize their collective communitarian past. That's what I basically do in many other ways. So the basic argument of my dissertation is very simple. It's an open-ended kind of argument. It is arguing that the ways through which Dalits are trying to talk about their past can neither be entirely grasped by the way by different ways of resistance that subaltern studies talks about, and at the same time they are not. That doesn't necessarily mean that these conceptualizations of the past are to be completely made sense of through an unquestionable negotiation with what we call Enlightenment modernity, roughly. So neither of these two sides can be an adequate lens through which we can look at the Dalits' conceptualization of the past. And so the two registers that I spoke of in this chapter of my dissertation are trying to explain this broader argumentative argument that cuts across the entire dissertation. In this part of Bengal, in the last 10 to 12 years roughly, somewhat more than that, but more prominently in these last 10 to 12 years, in different parts of the state of West Bengal, alongside other parts of the country in this entire South Asian subcontinent, particularly in India, there has been a rise of what we call politics of autochthony. This is something that has been quite prominent in different other parts of the country. I'm aware of similar articulations of autochthony in Maharashtra, in northern India, in some parts of the southern India, most particularly in Tamil Nadu, in which we come across articulations like this, that the scheduled castes, scheduled tribes, other backward castes, and the lower, primarily in economic terms, lower sections of the Muslim population belong to what these ideologues are describing as the Mool-Nivashi constituencies, the Mool-Nivashi community. That is to say that these are the constituencies that are the traditional dwellers of this landmass called India. You can think of it in broader non-statist terms like South Asia and so on. But that is the argument. So there are two polar opposite constructions of identity, as it were, in these articulations. One is at least in the context of West Bengal, on one side of the spectrum, we have the three caste Hindus, the three caste Hindu upper caste constituencies, Kayasthas, Brahmins, and Vaidhas. They roughly constitute what the Mool-Nivashi ideologues are describing as the Aryan bloc and the non-Aryan original inhabitants. So the Aryans are the outsiders, they are the invaders of this land, and the non-Aryan groups, scheduled castes, scheduled tribes, and OBCs, and certain sections of the Muslim population, they are the original inhabitants. The rationale for including Muslims, some sections of the Muslim population within this template of Mool-Nivashi, is that these are converted Muslims, right? And they are suggesting that since these are the original inhabitants, the Mool-Nivashis, the Bhumiputras of these areas, they have a more legitimate claim on what we call the nation state of India, as compared to the outsiders, as compared to the colonizers and foreigners, the Aryans, the Brahmins and Vaidhas and Kayasthas. So there is the polarization of identities there. And the Mool-Nivashi Istihar, written by a very important Mool-Nivashi ideologue and a regular, very familiar political commentator of the state of West Bengal at the moment, Dr. Nazrul Islam, a retired IPS officer. In that book, Mool-Nivashi Istihar, he describes these kind of polarization as a legitimate ground for them to talk about the autochthonous claims of the Mool-Nivashi movement. They are describing it as a movement. It, of course, has political underpinnings, immediate electoral political underpinnings, but in this brief presentation, it will be difficult for me to get into those things. If there is a Q&A on this, I'll be happy to respond. I'm going to talk about, very briefly, one very important cultural outcome of this politics of Mool-Nivashi movement that is known as Ashur Smaran Utshav, Oshur Smaran Utshav in different parts of the state of West Bengal. And this is becoming increasingly visible. There are different newspaper reports on this Oshur Smaran Utshav, in which Ashura is conceptualized as the hero of the non-Aryan social constituencies, SCs, STs, and OBCs, and also of some sections of the Muslims, as I said. The Munlibashi hero is the Ashura, and Ashura, according to this mythical kind of narrative, was duped by the Aryan goddess Durga, and that is how he was killed, and the Aryan invasion was cemented, solidified, and that is how the caste Hindu dominance and hegemony in the political, economic, and cultural sphere of Bengal started. They are, of course, not engaged with the different theories of late Aryanization in Bengal, which is, of course, another important segment of our discussion, possibly a very important segment of our discussions, but that's something that they are not explicitly engaging with. They're simply suggesting, and they are quite aligned with the rest of the country's similar tendencies of Munlibashi politics. They're simply suggesting that these are the two poles of identity politics that we witness, and we need to do something about it. Now, there are two ways through which this Munlibashi politics is constructed. One, it is premised upon the present economic, cultural, and political precarity of these constituencies. So it's basically a kind of shared victimhood upon which their idea of autochthony is constructed. They are simply suggesting that the SC, ST, OBC, and some sections of the Muslim population are co-sufferers at the hands of the dominant communities like Brahmins, Buddhas, and Caistas. All the political parties are completely controlled by these constituencies, these castes, and therefore the SC, ST, OBCs, and some Muslims need to create a solidarity front. We might describe it as the Munlibashi front, in order to negotiate with the dominant political parties, especially in terms of the caste Hindu dominance within the political parties, the mainstream electoral political parties, and also, if possible, establish their own political party to do away with the kind of political dominance that Brahmins, Buddhas, and Caistas have enjoyed in post-colonial India. So that is one register through which they are constructing the Munlibashi politics. And the other one is the way they are reconstructing the myth of Aryan invasion in the subcontinent. So the Aryanhood myth is something that we need to briefly discuss here, and then I'll move on to my brief engagement with how the domes are articulating themselves and how those utterances depart from the lens offered by subaltern studies historians like Ranajit Guha. So the second one through which Munlibashi politics is constructed, the second characteristic, second attribute of it is this reorientation of the Aryan myth. Any discussion on the Aryan myth will get into different trajectories. One way of looking at it is to follow the path of Dorothy Figueira, a comparatist who worked on the different discursive trajectories that connect 18th century European anxiety to look for a pure civilizational point of beginning, some kind of ur-religion, some original religious spiritual ethos that can put an end to the corruptions of revealed religions in that time's Christianity. We have the French philosophers like Voltaire, Montesquieu, and others taking that direction. And then that had further implications for the German romantics, Schlegel, Herder, Humboldt, and many others. So there is a line of thought in which we might see how Orientalist writings, early Indological scholarships push us into a direction of Aryanhood, Aryan supremacy. That's one way of looking at it. It's by and large, methodologically speaking, it is dependent on global intellectual history kind of trope. And this, in turn, influenced Indian nationalist thought. It influenced Vivekananda, it influenced Ram Mohan, it influenced, also, by and large, it also influenced Indian modernity. So we have references to Bankim Chandra Chatterjee. They are all assimilating and twisting and appropriating the myth of Aryanhood as they came across through different utterances of the German Romantics, the British Romantics, and before them the French philosophers like Voltaire and others. The other mythical appropriation of the Aryan invasion theory happens through the writings of Jyotiba Phule, the 19th century Marathi reformer, who started suggesting that the Aryans are outsiders and therefore they do not have a legitimate claim on this landmass as compared to the Shudras and the Atishudras. This is what we come across in his magnum opus Gulamgiri, slavery, in other words. So the Mullibashi ideologues like Shopan Kumar Vishwas and Nazrul Islam, they draw inspiration from Phule, but they also depart from Phule's influence in the sense that Phule came up with fetishization of a Kshatriya status. So Phule was basically trying to argue that the toiling, laboring classes, the Shudras and the Atishudras, were basically descendants of a Kshatriya clan, which was defeated by the invading Aryans, and there is a reconceptualization of Shivaji as a Shudra king, but at the same time there was a simultaneous nationalist appropriation of this Kshatriya reconceptualization of Shivaji, as well as appropriation of the Aryan myth in largely nationalist rhetoric. So we have a early Indological Orientalist kind of scholarship and discourse on the myth of Aryan invasion in the Indian subcontinent. We have a nationalist appropriation of that. Then there is a Phule-like or E.V. Ramaswamy Periyar-like appropriation of the same mythical structure in Maharashtra and Tamil Nadu, respectively. And now in the Mullibashi movement, we see another kind of appropriation of that. The point of departure in this Mullibashi politics is that there is no need, there is no at least explicit discursive need for these ideologues like Islam and Vishwas to claim a high ritual status. In fact, they depart from that. And they are suggesting that we need to embrace the low ritual rank and turn the table upside down. So we need to just reverse this whole mythical narrative and politically suggest, and quite forcefully suggest, that these are Aryan outsiders. There is no Aryan supremacist theory for us. We don't accept that ideological suggestion, and instead we have our own politics of autochthony. And it is in this context that they are reconfiguring the Ashura, Mahishasura. There are different celebrations of what they call Hudur Durga Utshav in Purulia, in Bankura, parts of Jhargram and West Midnapur district, my home district, but also in Malda and Murshidabad, and even in some parts of South Kolkata, in Godia and some neighborhoods in South Kolkata. So this Mullibashi politics and its most prominent cultural articulation in the form of Ashur Sharan Utsav is something that is quite increasingly visible in modern West Bengal. then let me just quickly talk about the domes and their cultural articulations. The domes constitute a large number of Dalit population in southwestern Bengal. In my chapter, I have discussed the writings of Pitambar Hathi, Narayan Shamat, and Bishambar Hathi and Shautik Hathi. Their poems, their non-fictional prose pieces, some of the pamphlets, political pamphlets, activist pamphlets that they have come up with. And I looked into these writings, articulations, and realized, and before actually making this visit to these parts of Jhargram and West Midnapur and parts of Purulia, I had already read Ranajit Guha's quite an interesting essay called "The Career of an Anti-God in Heaven and on the Earth." On Earth, and in that essay, Guha is suggesting that the myth of Rahu is something that the Dalits appropriate, and especially the group that W.W. Briggs described as the Dome group. It consists of other constituencies like the Valmikis, the Vangs, and so on. So they all belong to what Briggs calls the Dome group. And Guha suggests that the Dome group, when they came across the Brahminical mythical narratives in which they were projected, the Dome groups, the Dome constituency was projected as belonging to the clan of Rahu. They twisted these mythological narratives, and they did not completely debunk the mythological them, and came up with their own narratives that would sabotage the Brahminical Aryan supremacist mythical narratives. So in this chapter, we see two apparently contradictory engagements with myths. On one hand, we see the Mulnivashis appropriating the myth of Aryanhood, taking inspiration from Jyotiba Phule and Periyar, at the same time departing from them, at least departing from Phule and Periyar and going closer to Ambedkar. At the same time, it is not something that Ambedkar prescribed, because we must remember that Ambedkar himself never really subscribed to the myth of Aryan invasion to explain the caste system in India. For Ambedkar, there were other theories, the theory of broken men, for instance, in Who Were the Untouchables text. So for Ambedkar, there are different theories, the theory of ideological contestations between Brahmanism and Buddhism and so on. Ambedkar is not somebody who subscribed to Aryan myth in terms of racialized myth of Aryanhood. He didn't consider Aryan as a race. And modern anthropological studies are actually validating Ambedkar's opinions. There are important works by people like Anand Sharma and so on. So they are creating a strange kind of, at times, very eclectic mix of mythical articulations that we come across in the Mulnivashi politics. That's on one hand. And on the other end of the spectrum, we have Dome writers and activists coming up with narratives that do not entirely align with the kind of observations that are made by Ranajit Guha in that essay, The Career of an Anti-God. In The Career of an Anti-God, Guha is simply trying to suggest that the Dome group is participating, as it were. There is no radical point of departure. There is no fundamental contestation of the Brahminical mythical narrative in which these constituencies are associated with the clan of Rahu, but simply a subscription to the larger contours of that mythical narrative. And within that, they are trying to resist, right? So he gives us the example, Guha gives us the example of somebody called Supach Bhagat, who is an important, almost mythical figure of the Dome community, who once upon a time, there was a feast that was offered by Haro Parboti and Shrupaj Bhagat, along with his Dome community members, were invited to participate in that feast, but they were late. They were late, and therefore they were forced to have the leavings of the other caste groups, the leftover food that was there for them. They had to eat that, and ever since that point of time, they have been a group of people known as Jutan Khai, right? So people living on leftover food. That's the way they are simply twisting these mythical narratives. That's the way Guha looks at it. But when I came across the writings of Shautik Hathi, Vishwambar Hathi, Pitambar Hathi, and did these quote-unquote field trips. I'm not a trained social scientist like many of you here, but as a scholar of literary studies, I thought I should go there. And when I went there and talked to these people, gathered these texts, and created my own kind of archive, I realized that a lot of things have changed, and the articulations of these so-called dome poets and writers and activists are neither, in a very superficial fashion, can be described as statist, as articulations constantly negotiating their ways with the post-colonial state. So in that sense, they are not necessarily very modern articulations, quote unquote. So there is a kind of agreement with the subaltern studies' larger philosophical views in terms of non-modern ways of being in this world, as Chakravarti and Devjani Ganguly and others have put it. And at the same time, they are not really mythical, quote-unquote, non-modern in the way subaltern studies historians put it, ways of being in this world, right? So there is, they are using poetry, they are using jatra. There are two dominant sections in terms of the professions that they have. There are two different prominent sections in the Dome community in that part of Bengal. One is known as Shilpi Dome, the other one is known as Bajonia Dome. So the popular idea that domes are mostly, people burning dead bodies is also something that takes a hit here. And there are two important professional domains that are there traditionally belonging to the Dome community. The Shilpi domes create what we call chubri or jhora and so on, with something that is close to the bamboo species, but not exactly bamboo. The Bajonia domes are people who play dhaks during pujas and so on, and different other musical instruments. So these are the two, professionally speaking, two segments of the Dome community that I came across in those regions of Bengal. And in the articulations that I came across, there is no overt need for them to hobnob with the political powers that be, to negotiate with the state machinery. Of course, also do those things, but the cultural literary articulations are not to be completely exhausted through that kind of prism. It can't be made sense of through that particular prism. And at the same time, they are not operating within the mythical universe constructed already by the Brahminical cultural hegemonic discourse. So they depart from that as well, not just in the kind of half departure that Guha notices, but a complete indifference to that mythical structure that Guha talks about in that essay, The Career of an Anti-God. So for me, I think the Dalit historiographic constructions are so varied and heterogeneous that it is almost impossible for us to come up with a particular trope to look at Dalit reconstructions of the past. And that is where a larger philosophical proposition occurs in my dissertation, in which I'm trying to revisit the way subaltern studies historians have rightly critiqued the Hegelian philosophy of history, the philosophical tradition, the philosophy of history tradition that goes back to Giambattista Vico through Benedetto Croce and R.G. Collingwood, and of course through Hegel's philosophy of world history. I see that there is, when I look at the Dalit narratives of modern Bengal, I don't think they can either be interpreted very conveniently through the subaltern studies lens, in which they have a tendency to undermine the political dimension, explicit political dimensions of these articulations in some way or the other. It's always an incomplete kind of story of resistance for most of the subaltern studies historians. And at the same time, they are not completely aligned with the coordinates of modernity, the state, belief in science, and other templates of modernity that we are familiar with. So, in other words, Dalit historiography is contingent, is, as I argue in another chapter of my dissertation, ontological, and therefore there is no easy template or lens to look at Dalit historiography. Right? That's where I end. Thank you. Yeah. So question. Okay, there are 2-3 questions.
Okay,
I think, yeah, Jadip, go ahead.
Go.
Go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Kullan, for your very insightful and your thesis. I have a few, not question, but few queries.
Sorry, you are not audible. Your voice is broken.
So, hello. Now, is it okay? Okay.
Yeah, it's okay.
So, thank you first of all, and I have some queries because when you end that your particular this paper, where you questioning about the historiography and the Dalit question. Just I ask, so, and also you are pointing out the phenomenology and then the ontological aspect, which is actually criticized the R.J. Collingwood and others, also Hegel. First of all, are you just questioning about the writing of the Dalit question? Is it a act of criticizing history as a whole, like history as a whole in terms of I am bringing out the very earlier history, right?
Yeah, your voice is completely.
Hello. Hello.
Could you just repeat the last section of your question?
So you were asking about the history as a whole, right? Which is very fundamental, because if we look into the question of the Dalit question and the right-wing politics, particularly in BJP's ideologue, Savarkar's writing history is very epochal, and his books also, this 6 classical epoch in Indian history, right? And also we look into the this Jadunath Sarkar, also Ramesh Chandra Majumdar, their way of writing of history. And simultaneously you are questioning about the historiography and the ontological possibility of the history of Dalit. So do you criticize that kind of writing and the how the question of Dalit itself the make history in singularity in terms of ontological direction? Have you get my point, is Kalyan?
Yeah, I think I have got it, but
yeah, that is very significant in terms of this Savarkar and others also. And yes.
Right. Are you suggesting that there is apparently a similarity between the way Dalits are thinking of their past and the way Savarkar and other Hindutva people also thinking about past? Are you suggesting that, or?
Yeah.
Okay.
That's a way of your
right. I'll respond to that. I'll take the other questions as well. I think Tanya and Shumitda had a question. Shumit Roy. Tanya, could you unmute yourself and ask the question? I'll take all the questions together. What about Shumitda? Shumit Rai? Shumitda, are you there? Okay, I think they are not there. So I'll quickly respond to Joydeep's question. No, I don't think these are similar conceptualizations of the past. I think okay, let me begin by talking about Savarkar's writings. In some of Savarkar's writings, we apparently have articulations that are very similar to even that of Ambedkar, even those of Ambedkar. For instance, Savarkar talks about Saptabandi, 7 shackles, in which he says that there are 7 problems of the Hindu society that have not allowed the Hindu society to create a socio-politically united front, something that they should have constructed, but they couldn't because of these 7 shackles, 7 limitations, problems. And within the 7 shackles, there are references to a ban, the Hindu society's ban on interdining, on intercaste marriages, and so on. So when Savarkar talks about these issues, it seems he's a great Hindu social reformer trying to put an end to untouchability, if not the caste system as such. So on that note, I think Savarkar's articulations or Golwalkar's articulations apparently look similar to the kind of narratives that I was talking about, but I don't think there is any fundamental similarity between these two, for the simple reason, when the Hindutva Brigade focus on myths, they do not want the myths to be treated as myths. They want myths to be treated as statist histories. Right? So the gap, the ideological gap, the discursive gap between mythical reconstructions of the past and the statist Hegelian kind of notions of the past, they come very close to each other in the Hindutva articulations. That is something that doesn't happen in my readings of the Dalit narratives that I could get to read. So I don't think they're similar. I mean, I think the Hindutva mythical history is something that tries to project a certain kind of notion of the history as the monolithic statist history, right? And this kind of hobnobbing with the Hegelian template does not allow them to go closer to the kind of articulations of the past that I come across in Dalit narratives, right? I don't think that is the case. Apparently, yeah, it seems that they are all departing from the rational, objective, fact-based, evidence-based kind of Hegelian template of history, but you scratch a bit further and realize that in case of the Dalit narratives, these are neither modern, not non-modern, and they do not go closer to the Hegelian template. In fact, in my dissertation, I also argue that it is an enormously limited way of looking at Ambedkar's writings as the discursive source of inspiration for Dalit writings, to simply think of Ambedkar as a torchbearer of enlightenment modernity. I think Ambedkar is a far more complex thinker. So, and I delve deeper into some of Ambedkar's intellectual inheritances. For instance, the influence of American pragmatism on Ambedkar, the influence of Buddhism on Ambedkar, in order to argue that these can be connected to, philosophical traditions that have contested the dominance of Enlightenment modernity in the West. On one end of the spectrum, on the other end of the spectrum, we can think of anti-foundationalist philosophical schools like Buddhism in India that contested the kind of Advaita philosophy's insistence on Atma and so on. And we all know the history of how 19th century Bengal especially, in which we saw the Indian native elites responding to the Christian missionaries' allegations of idol worshipping and polytheism. Responding to those things, they embraced Advaita Vedantism. And in the way I see these Dalit writings, I think they do not, they cannot be aligned with such cultural nationalist appropriations of India's philosophical past. So, in other words, they are not similar. Right?
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, Doipanda, are you there? What happened to Doipanda?
I'm here.
Okay.
My computer just fell asleep for a second.
Oh, I see. Okay.
I think Tanya had a question. Tanya Dhara. Tanya, are you there?
Something went wrong with Tanya's connection. Okay, if we do not have any other question, I think we should move on to Dipanda's presentation. Dipanda?
Hey, no, are you sure? I mean, Tanya had a,
But she can always ask the question later on, at the end of this workshop.
Acha, it's getting late there, right?
Yeah, that's the point.
It's nearly 9 o'clock there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's 8:48. Right.
ঠিক আছে, if you're okay with it, I'll go ahead.
Yeah, please go ahead. Let's
okay.
Listen to what you have to say. Yeah.
We should wrap things up. Oh, let me turn on my my camera. এখন আলোতে আর একটু ভালো দেখা যাচ্ছে. Okay. So the paper I circulated was clearly a rough draft. One day I hope it'll form one of the chapters of an ongoing study that I'm focused on, which is about the colonial census. The study attempts a reinterpretation of this mechanism and its significance for modern India. This piece is actually out for review, so we'll see where that goes. And I'm just I'm hoping to get some feedback from all of you as well. So here's what I'm trying to do in the piece, and here I'm merely kind of repeating my tentative conclusions. The paper has explored the late 19th century census in Bengal to substantiate a number of propositions. That the census originated in considerations of political economy, that it underwent an implementation that depended on the enumerative labor of key personnel among the subaltern classes and elicited a relative collaboration from the people, that it acquired implications largely concerning the colonial state's future economic policies, and perhaps most crucially, that caste and communal identities acquired heightened meaning in a milieu in which prior aspirations to caste respectability and social esteem found expression through the census. If enumeration became a conductor for identity formation, this was because Indians themselves saw in the technique a means whereby to advance their aspirations for caste respectability and distinction within the dynamics of capitalist social relations. So, to spell out the theoretical premises on which this paper rests, the census inaugurated a process of conceiving subjectivity that mirrored the distinction between use and exchange value, and correspondingly the abstract and concrete dimensions of commodities. The enumerating function of the census simultaneously produced the individual as an abstract, disembodied, and commensurable entity, nonetheless the bearer of particular social features. In so doing, it reflected the dualistic nature of the commodity form, and as such, enumeration may be regarded as an extension of that structure within the realm of the state. The census seems to have translated the cellular quality of the commodity form into the domain of political subjectivities. The emergence of political identities like caste was, at least in part then, conditioned by the contemporaneously deepening practices of commodification that were radically transforming social and political life, of which the census was an important index. This was due not merely to what Benedict Anderson termed print capitalism, but the wider colonial and capitalist society in which that emergence was situated as well. The objectification of caste and community thus stemmed from the logic of capitalist social relations, in which the peoples of Bengal found resources to articulate their collective selfhood. Let me just say that again because that's really the main kind of takeaway point. The objectification of caste and community thus stemmed from the logic of capitalist social relations in which the peoples of Bengal found resources to articulate their collective selfhood. I've written, I'm just going to skip over a bit and then just one more paragraph. I just want to say a few words about why I've written this piece. Subaltern studies posited subaltern consciousness as a domain that was untouched by the institutions and forms of modernity. One can appreciate why they might have felt committed to such a stance. But I believe we can no longer afford such a luxury. It seems to me that understanding identity formation, which is really what this paper is about, how did late 19th century identities come about? It seems to me that understanding identity formation in modern India as deeply conditioned by capitalism, as opposed to colonial governmentality, obviously a Foucault-inspired concept, has several explanatory advantages that carry implications not only for how we understand the past, but the present as well. I can elaborate on these later, but for reasons intellectual and political, I think it's important for us to confront the ample evidence of subaltern selfhood, that is, consciousness and identity, being constituted by processes that can be best described as capitalist. So, just to reiterate the basic claim of the piece, that is, the census was less an act of colonial governmentality, as instead it was a kind of mediating, it played a mediating role between the wider context of capitalist social relations, capitalist modernity, which often gets spoken about as colonial modernity, and the formation of fairly hidebound caste identities. And those of you who had the chance to read my paper, in the final section, what I'm trying to illustrate with the Khatris, with the non-Shudros, with the various other caste groups that I touch on briefly, is precisely this process. Anyhow, I will stop now. Okay, Tanya and Anirban have raised their hand. Is Tanya there?
I think her hand has just been raised from the previous session.
Okay. Go ahead, Anirban.
Yeah, okay, yeah. Thank you. So thank you for the paper. I'm obviously sympathetic to the attempt that you're taking, and I think it's important. So I don't really have any direct specific questions as such, but a series of observations and perhaps suggestions. So if I understood your paper correctly, you are making two distinct claims. One is that the census was motivated by what you call distinctly political economic as opposed to governmental intentions. And the second claim is that it met with the collaboration of the people, that is the people found in the process of the creation of the census, something that they could relate to. So I think at the paper that you shared with us, although I think when you were speaking, you did clarify a few things, but I think in the paper you sent us, the two distinct arguments don't really gel very well together in their current form. And I think I can find at least three reasons for that. So the first reason would be if the colonial state is the agent, right, which sometimes appears to be what you're saying, if the colonial state is the agent that created the possibility of social abstraction, then we are really back to colonialism as the meta category for the period, right? So capitalism becomes merely a description of what the colonial state is doing. And I think in terms of your argument of political economy versus governmentality, I think one of the obvious criticisms would be that one can actually think of political economy as a form of governmentality. So I think if you want to make that distinction central to your paper, then I think you would need to directly engage with the place where this argument is made, which is Foucault's lectures published as Security, Territory, Population, that book. So I think that would be something to do directly. You do mention Foucault somewhere, but you don't really engage directly with that book. So that could be a criticism. Somebody might raise that. And the second claim that the census categories found some purchase in the minds and actions of the people, I'm convinced here by how caste as a category itself found purchase. But I think the way capitalism as a category found purchase needs to be, I think, developed or clarified more.
Yes.
I think what you mean by capitalism needs to come much earlier in the paper. You sort of leave it till the very end. You need to, bring it forward, and the conceptual work for this, I think, needs to be woven into the narrative itself, because at the moment it sort of jumps at the reader very suddenly. And then the final point in this regard, I would say, is that I would say the same thing about the use value binary, right? When you were speaking, you made that very central to your explanation. But in the paper, it really just comes at the end. It almost feels like an epilogue or something like that. Right?
Yes,
I think you have to decide whether it's a framing device, and I think it can work as a framing device. But if it is, it needs to come much earlier and needs to be part of the conceptual framework, and you sort of need to refer to the categories again and again as you go through the narrative, because otherwise it seems like the narrative is separate and then the categories are just sort of an afterthought. And my main suggestion here is that I'm not sure, it's not clear to me that caste precedence, the category you use, is the best way to actually show the relevance of these two categories, because ultimately the notion of caste precedence is at some level still tied to notions of ritual rank and hierarchy, right? So it seems to me that it might actually be more fruitful, and I don't know, but it might be, to look at moments when different castes are actually talking about different things. Instead of talking about caste directly, maybe they are talking about school reform, right, or education. Maybe they're talking about land, maybe they're talking about labor, maybe they're talking about markets, right? These are sort of the I think the places where the valence of the abstract individual might actually come up in ways that you might be able to draw out. And as I was actually reading the paper, one thing that I thought of, and also it struck me as you were talking about the abstract versus concrete dimensions, for example, is upper caste discourses that are perhaps not directly related to the census. For example, the attempt to develop an Indian political economy, right, with people like Mahadev Govind, Ranade, etc. And he explicitly states, when he tries to distinguish Indian political economy from classical political economy, or which has become a sort of handmaiden of imperialism, he actually says that what distinguishes Indian political economy is the embeddedness of the economy in the institutions of caste and the joint family, right? Because that brings a sense of concrete belonging, which the abstract categories of classical political economy don't have, right? So I think these are just some of the things you might think about to make the framework more central from the very beginning, and perhaps more persuasive. And just a couple of other small points. On page 5, you have this large paragraph on the increase of certain sort of things, economic indicators to show that commercialization is occurring, and perhaps to show the relevance of capitalism. I don't think that Tirthankar Roy and the idea of increase is really very useful for your argument, because what you're really trying to say is that there is a qualitative shift, right? You're not just making an argument about increase, you're talking about a qualitative shift. So I think, for example, Manu Goswami's book would be a much better actually thing to build upon here, because she covers the entire second half of the 19th century.
Right.
She's talking about a qualitative shift rather than just quantitative increases. And then the last small observation, towards the end of the paper, pages 22, 23, sometimes when you write sentences, you seem to treat the census almost like an independent agent, like you say that the census, etc. And that seems to me to undercut your larger aim, because the census is done by the colonial state, and you're trying to say that there is a larger social form which can tell us something about the relevance of the census and how people are relating to the census. So I would just be a little careful about the language there, because people who will want to disagree will latch on to those moments very easily. So
there are many. Thank you so much, Anirban. I mean, this is really wonderful kind of collection of comments. There are many people who are very unhappy.
Yes, I can imagine.
You can imagine, right? This kind of an argument is it's not going to pass easily. I appreciate your suggestions about the restructuring of the paper, and I should very much say that it's entirely a rough draft, and now I have about a month or two to kind of revise it. So this is helpful. The various points you noted are helpful. I would just say that, I'm just reiterating what I started out with, that, see, I mean, I'm sure you are familiar with, the tremendous influence that Barney Cohn's essay, the census essay, had on an entire generation. And what I'm really trying to do is, in a sense, write against that essay. And write against Nick, write against Arjuna Pathurai, Gyan Pandey. This entire way that an entire generation of students has grown up thinking about identity formation. So, to your and my mind, given our, training and our proclivities, the proposition that capitalism is a kind of formative force in identity formation, and in this case, caste identity formation, may not be so kind kind of radical. But it seems to me that for much of the field, and for many of our colleagues in South Asian history, saying something like this is akin to, heresy. So, I'm still trying to work through how best to go about saying this, given that this is the kind of environment that we're in. I do think you're absolutely right that I need to define and my terms earlier on. I for some reason I thought bringing motion right at the end might be a kind of interesting stylistic device. I don't know if it worked or not, but it was just my way of paying homage to him, and he was my teacher, and so I wanted him in a sense to have the last word. But yeah, I'm painfully aware of how far this piece has to go to actually stand on its own feet. But yeah, other questions? Thank you, Anirban. Any other questions? Shamrad?
Maybe not a question exactly, but just a query. Just in a completely different context, just thinking aloud, the influence of capitalism in identity formation, and also in a certain way of creating resistant identity. I work and stay in Purulia, and I was talking about the new urban spaces which are coming up, and the kind of intrusion of capitalism in the life of the everyday, and the way the identities are reconstructed because of these new urban spaces, the shopping malls, the big restaurants, because the small towns in India, in Bengal more also, they are very very caste-based. It is located in the border of Jharkhand, and there is a kind of very test, sometimes very overt casteism, not like the typical Bengali Bhadralok kind of casteism, which is at work in Purulia. The houses are not rented to people from lower caste and Muslims, and this kind of people are identified with their surnames. But that somehow gets dispelled by this intrusion of capitalism, apparently. So I was just thinking that.
Yeah, no, I mean, certainly, in terms of there's that, I'm sure you recall that famous phrase, all that is solid melts into air. So, to that degree, I hear what you're saying, although, in so many cases, it doesn't actually melt into air. It kind of gets recalibrated or reformed into something else.
Yeah, because on the other hand, the new spaces which are constructed, they are often occupied by the Marwaris, who belong to the upper caste again, and because most of the lands in Purulia, they belong to the native people because of their tribal identity, tribal roots. But they are taking the lands on lease and like establishing the restaurants and hotels. So the power remains at the end of the day in the hands of the privileged caste. So that is also
right. No, I mean, this broader intervention that Anirban is making in his own ways, that I'm trying to make in some ways, is really born of the sense that a kind of frustration in some ways with identitarianism, with particularly not just Dalit identitarianism, but identitarianism of various kinds. And that way of thinking, that has infiltrated so much of public life the world over, certainly in India, certainly in the United States. But, you know, the question very easily becomes, where do identities come from? Right? I mean, I was telling Kollan the other day that when I was doing research in the late first decade of the 2000s, people would ask me, what is this thing, Dalit? A Dalit jinishta ki? That was 2008, right? And so it just seems to me that we need to root our understandings of how identities come about, how they're formed, in something else. Right? It cannot merely be ritual, it cannot merely be religion, it cannot merely be culture. Right? I mean, all of these idealist features, they're ultimately rooted in something. And to my mind, the best kind of concept that that kind of identifies that something is capitalism. Anyway, that's just a bit of an aside. I see our numbers have dwindled. I mean, of course, it's getting late. Kullan, should we just wrap it up now, or do you want to do that final session?
No, I think we can wrap it up, but we can at least for some time we can just open this entire platform to the other participants, mostly listeners, but also certainly the other presenters. We can just have a free flowing discussion of some sort.
Yeah. No, let's open it up to everyone. It is 11:44 here. Let's spend about 15 minutes on this.
Yeah, roughly.
Okay. Because I know it's getting late in Kolkata.
Yeah, so by 9:30 we should be able to conclude our workshop.
Okay. So people, the floor is open to raise any questions or observations about the workshop, about the themes the workshop covered, about what we might do moving ahead with critical caste studies, whether people are interested in publishing something. There are any number of issues we could discuss. So the floor is open. Yes, Ratul?
Yes, I have a small comment to make on the entire proceeding. That, I think that the question of the positionality of the middle ranking agricultural caste, that still is somewhat underrepresented in this whole conversation. I think that it is important to bring their particular case to sharper focus, because their kind of subjectivity is a very problematic subjectivity, and it is also malleable, I think, and I think that it would be great if they are particularly those groups who are demanding the other backward caste status currently. I think their movement and their particular, and also not studying them not as distinguished from the larger, world of capitalism. How they are positioned in the larger world of capitalism. I think it is important to bring that in focus going forward.
Yes, yes. I mean, Shumadhura's paper was obviously the most germane in that respect, because she was talking about non-Dalit groups. But this is something that Kullan and I have discussed quite a bit, which is the need to, and it's very interesting to think about why. Why has there been so much focus on the non-Shudras as opposed to other caste groups? Other caste groups that are, numerically even larger. I mean, if I'm not mistaken, the Baglis, population-wise, are larger than the non-Shudras. I may be wrong about this, but I seem to remember having seen something to this effect. Why don't we know anything about them? Hardly. I can't think of a single book that has been written about, in maybe in the English language publishing world.
Yeah, I think in Bangla there are some works.
Yeah,
I can immediately think of, I think Bikash Bagdi's book, Banglar Bagdi Samaj or something like that.
right.
But there is hardly anything available in the English-speaking world, the English scholarship, especially in the global academia. I don't see, whenever we talk about the caste question in Bengal, I don't think there is adequate focus on either the Bagdis or the Bauris. I don't see that. But in Bangla, because I have worked on the Bauris and the Pondo Khatriyas and some other communities other than the Namashudras, I do have a collection of very interesting Bangla books on these communities, academic as well as so-called non-academic writings.
Right. But yeah, I think it really cuts to the question of how do we understand caste as a social form. You can't do that adequately when there's such a disproportionate emphasis on particular groups over others. I can't remember the last time. I mean, I've heard all kinds of proposals about Brahmin studies.
Shamarta, একটু mute করো.
The Brahmin studies, quote unquote upper caste studies, but I haven't seen anything yet. And of course, we need studies of the caste throughout the hierarchy. I think it's really a kind of liberal reflex that has made so many scholars focus on the marginalized at the expense of the dominant, really. I mean, it would be wonderful if we had a study, a really serious study, on the Bengali Brahmins. It would take a lot, but we do need a study like that. Anyway, I'll shut up. I've been just rambling on.
Shamarta, you had something to add.
Yeah, adding on to what Kullan was saying.
You are not audible. You are not audible. And there is so much noise.
Hello.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was just thinking of the experiences, as you talked about the experiences of the Bagdis. There are experiences of other caste also. Like there is this autobiography called Eka Kumbho which is about the potter class. He's talking about life, and there is this Monotosh Boshak's book, Tati Upakhan, which is about the. So these caste experiences should also be taken into cognizance because they are not very like prolific, like so many in numbers, like the Namashudra autobiographies, but should also be perhaps studied. The experiences of other castes also. Because a Brahmin may not be, as people were saying that a Brahmin may not be writing his autobiography as the autobiography of a Brahmin. But that is difficult to delineate unless some scholar takes up Brahmin studies or something like that. So, but in marginal caste, we can, or middle caste also, you can take it up from there.
Yeah.
Because, in certain cases, Adhir Vishwas's works, he talks about his Napita identity.
Right. Other considerations? Anybody else want to make any?
Can I add?
Yeah, Anirban, please go ahead.
Yeah, I just.
তোমার ভিডিওটা চালিয়ে দাও.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I just want to add, like, just following on the trail of the discussion right now about whom to study. I mean, obviously it's an important question, but along with the question of whom to study, I think we are also underestimating the problem of how to study. Right? Because classically in the 1960s, 70s, among anthropologists, the debate was field view versus book view, etc. Right? So texts, normative texts have obviously been written about what caste should be, or written by Brahmins and upper castes. And the field view practitioner says, let's do ethnography, etc. So, of course, if you want to study the contemporary period, we can always do ethnography. But if you want to, just think of sources, I mean, studying the Brahmins is going to be far easier than studying the Bhagvis, because the Brahmins have produced, millions of texts if the focus is on texts. Whereas the Bhagvis clearly haven't, and the fact that they haven't produced as much is a fact, is a legacy of the system of caste itself. So and I also think that just as important as texts are, and as Kollan pointed out and Shomrat also pointed out, that there are texts in Bangla by other castes. If the focus is going to be on how the system reproduces, which is the mandate of the workshop, then I don't think that solely focusing on texts by anybody is going to give us a full insight. Obviously, texts by upper castes are not going to give us an insight into that for obvious reasons, because they have an interest in the system functioning as the way it has. But I don't think the focus on text by anybody will give us an insight into the functioning of the system as such. And if we are studying the contemporary period, we can do ethnographic work, of course, which several of the participants have done. But it is a serious question if you want to understand more about the past, even the colonial period, late 19th, early 20th century. Exactly how does one do that? Study other groups who have neither produced texts of their own to any significant degree, and nor have been very important directly in the kind of politics leading up to the partition or even after that. So it is a significant question as to how we can use different archives. So my approach is one, trying to look at other spheres where caste is practically important, like land, markets, etc. And there could be other ways, but it is along with the question of whom to study, the question of how to study, I think, is a very big elephant in the room.
Absolutely, and it's. I suspect it's going to take years. I mean, it's because of the way caste studies, Dalit studies has developed, and it's kind of developed its own kind of calcification. To break out of that mold, to again, and this goes back, Kullan, to the start of the session, where this question of how do we think beyond Ambedkarism? I feel it's a major issue for us. And please don't misunderstand me to be saying that we need to reject Ambedkar. That's not what I'm saying at all. But I do think, the kinds of concerns we've discussed about Dalit identitarianism, for example, do mean that, why do we do all of this? Why does all of this matter to us? At one level, I like to think it's because we're exhausted by caste. We want this social form to be annihilated, to be overcome, to be transcended, whatever it is. And I think at some level, those of us who are involved in this project, who will take it forward in all sorts of ways, I don't think we can afford to lose sight of that. That why does all this scholarship matter? As much as the how, Anirban, that how do we go about studying it? I think I would just encourage us to, reflect on why we do the scholarship we're doing. And my hunch is that we're all sick and tired of caste. We just wish it would die. Anyway, others?
No, just to continue that line of our discussion on not just what to read, but also how to read. I agree with Anirban that there has to be some kind of methodological brainstorming as to how we can read about, how we can think about the past of those constituencies that have not come up with substantial textual corpus. But I think one of the things that most globally known South Asian historians by and large have overlooked, I mean, this is not a very qualified statement perhaps, but by and large, I think when it comes to our engagements with different Dalit constituencies or middle caste constituencies in the context of Bengal, I don't think people have, especially social scientists, historians, have adequately engaged even with the existing body of texts produced by certain communities. That's my experience. When I started traveling across the state of West Bengal during the early days of my PhD, I'm a literary studies scholar. I could have just restricted myself to available texts that I could get hold of, but I thought I should go out in the streets and see what is waiting for me. So when I started going to these places, I came across different kinds of literatures, and I use the word literature in the broadest possible sense, that were absolutely invisible to the urban academic eyes. Especially in the metropolitan places, we didn't have access to that kind of an archive, but the archive was there, scattered across different parts of the state, and I'm sure similar stories can be heard from different other parts of the subcontinent. So certainly we must do other kinds of methodologies in terms of how we can think of these people who are not directly participating in the unfolding of the modern world, but at the same time, many of them have produced some amount of textual with it. For instance, some of the texts that Shamarda mentioned and some of the texts that I mentioned have not been adequately engaged with. I mean, historians, social scientists working on South Asia, especially on Bengal, are so preoccupied with some. I don't know whether these are logistically more convenient, perhaps, because there is a large concentration of the Namashudra community in and around the city of Kolkata. I think that's one of the reasons why a lot of, and I'm just being, very somewhat superficial in making these comments, but I think a lot of the scholars working on the caste question in Bengal haven't just had the energy or the scope, or perhaps even the desire or enthusiasm or the logistics to travel across the state and look at different communities. I mean, I know, and I can think of Uday Chandra's volume on the politics of caste in Bengal, in which there is a chapter where my community, the Napit community, is categorized by a very otherwise fine historian, social scientist, as the scheduled caste community. I mean, if you look at the government list of the SC list, there is no Napit community. My community belongs to the other backward classes, right, in the state of West Bengal. And this, I'm suggesting that even if there is available archive and even if there is available textual work, I don't think we are very attentive as scholars, sadly. So I completely agree with Anirban, but at the same time, whatever little that we are, we can work on, that is also not being done, and that's so sad. That is one, and secondly, in terms of how we read, I was not necessarily implying that people like Aishwari and Daipananda, you are talking about, thinking beyond Ambedkar, not by deserting Ambedkar, as it were. I'm certainly not that naive, because I'm familiar with these writings. And Aishwari is a very good friend. We have been exchanging emails for a long time. I have written a preface to his book, Radical Equality. So I'm aware of those kinds of scholarship, and I myself will be very interested in that kind of scholarship. But at the same time, I think, the way Anirban focused on political economy, the way you are thinking of capitalism in your work, Dipanda, I think all these works, if I've not got it wrong, I think, and I see this mostly among historians, not so much in my discipline, but among social scientists, I see a lot of groups that are not okay with other groups. So subaltern study is talking about how liberalism and is problematic, how Marx's idea of the abstract individual is abstract labor is problematic, and so on and so forth. In Dinesh Chakraborty's provincializing Europe, abstract labor, etc. On the other end of the spectrum, we have people like Chibar and so there is a lot of bullfighting, and I am not really okay with it. I think methodologically, Ambedkar is more interesting to me, because Ambedkar offers us what I keep telling my students as contextual thinking. I mean, for Ambedkar, it is so important to deal with the problem at hand that he wouldn't shy away from engaging with schools of thought that he might not be otherwise okay with, right? Sadly, I see that spirit, that Ambedkarite spirit, missing in most of the kinds of engagements that we have. So somebody is doing a typically identitarian kind of Dalit studies research on the Dalit literatures and cultural articulations. Somebody who is more inclined towards political economy is just, trying to think of these things. Somebody who is interested in liberalism is trying to, like Spencer, for instance, he would be very uncomfortable with the subaltern studies school, and vice versa. So I don't think these are very helpful mentalities, academic mentalities, to work on something as complex, something as resilient as caste. I think we need to deploy as many methods and lenses and tropes as possible in order to, and perhaps simultaneously, So one might deploy all these methodologies. Why not combining all of them as much as possible? Of course, there is a limit to how we can manage so many things, but at least try and see if these things can speak to each other instead of simply one group suggesting that liberalism and modernity is important, the other group saying no, modernity is terrible. Look at Horkheimer and I don't know. And the other group suggesting no, both the Marxists and the subalternists are stupid people, misunderstanding caste. We are Dalits, we have access to lived experience, and therefore we have understood it all. So I think there is a lot of groupism in the way we are conducting our research on the caste question, not just in Bengal, but also beyond. And that is where I am somebody who doesn't have any kind of institutionalized or other kinds of affiliation. So I'm not, subalternists do not like my work, Dalit activists do not like my work, Marxists might not be okay with my kind of work. So I'm happy about it. I think, I would continue in that direction. That is critical caste studies for me, right? So it's in that sense that I was suggesting that we need to perhaps look into Ambedkar, and just this recently published book by Ashok Gopal makes me realize that so many things in Ambedkar's own writings that we have not been able to adequately engage with. So of course there is a necessity to look into political economy. Of course there is a necessity to look into the other avenues, but perspectival changes do not happen simply when we look into how, in terms of some kind of determinism or the other, understand how caste operates. Perspectival changes are just perspectival changes that are required. So I'm a staunch, rather very rigid kind of Ambedkarite there when I say that for me, it is important to look at how socially, and Ishita was trying to suggest similar things, I think, in her presentation, that it is important for us to prospectively engage with caste, to notionally engage with caste, psychologically think of the caste question, because, to look at caste in terms of property, to look at caste in terms of land, to look at caste in terms of political economy, to look at caste in terms of class, to look at caste in terms of consumerist capitalism. These things are not entirely unheard of. I mean, there are people who have done some work or the other, perhaps not extensive monograph length works, but people have done some works, right? So yeah, I think this is what we need to. Sorry, I'm just thinking aloud, perhaps.
No, that's fine. Anirban, thank you, Anirban.
I think Anirban had to leave for something. Yeah.
Let's wrap it up then.
Yeah. So I think
everyone.
I should particularly thank my students. They have done a wonderful job. Thank you, guys. You have been exceptionally efficient and prompt, and I can't thank you enough, all of you.
Yes, I would second that very much so, and thank you to all of you who stuck through these 7 hours with us. Thank you to Kollan, thank you to the participants, and have a very good night.
Yeah, good night, everybody.
Thanks a lot for organizing this. It's just wonderful. Good night.
Thank you. It was a lovely discussion. Thank you all.
Okay, good night.
Good night.
Good night. Bye-bye.